a teenage boy stood frozen at the metal detector. But when a K-9 officer refused to let him pass, the entire crowd fell silent. What did the dog sense hidden inside the boy's prosthetic leg that had everyone gasping in disbelief? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The air carried a strange stillness as Mason tightened his grip on Titan's leash, feeling the tension ripple through the powerful muscles beneath the dog's polished black coat. The streets around the hero's pavilion were already alive with movement. Vendors setting up flags and photo displays, families dressed in their Sunday best making their way toward the entrance, children laughing as they weaved between legs. But through it all, Titan was laser focused, his snout lifted slightly into the breeze, nostrils flaring as if the morning air carried a scent only he could understand. Mason scanned the surroundings with a veteran's instinct, his eyes darting across the early arrivals, noting every out-of-place movement, every uneasy glance. Titan had never reacted like this before, a routine sweep. Sure, he was trained to stay alert, but this was different. This was personal. His usual calm demeanor had given way to a readiness Mason hadn't seen since their last deployment overseas. That terrifying night in Helmand Province, when Titan's warning had saved an entire convoy from a roadside bomb. And now, here they were, on home soil, at a place meant for remembrance and peace. Yet that same low growl vibrated from Titan's chest, almost as if the ghosts of old battles were walking among the living. Mason crouched low, bringing his face close to Titan's, his voice a low whisper. "What is it, boy? Talk to me." But Titan's eyes remained locked on the entrance. His ears flicked forward, and his muscles coiled like a spring waiting to release. Mason rose slowly, his heartbeat sinking with the slow, measured steps they took toward the metal detectors lining the entrance. The gala wasn't supposed to start for another hour, but already the line was forming, men and women wearing medals that shimmered beneath the rising sun, their eyes shadowed by memories they rarely spoke of. Mason's gaze settled on a figure at the far end of the queue, a teenage boy standing alone, head bowed, a military cap pulled down low over his eyes, and a limp that seemed too practiced to be natural. Titan let out a low, guttural rumble and strained against the leash, his body drawn toward the boy like a magnet to hidden steel. Mason felt his gut twist. His instincts screamed that this wasn't just another child paying tribute. This was the beginning of something none of them were ready for. He moved closer, his mind racing through 100 scenarios, every worst-case possibility playing out like a reel of old war footage behind his eyes. And in that moment, under the soft glow of the morning light, Mason knew without a doubt that this day, this seemingly ordinary assignment, was about to become a moment they'd all remember for the rest of their lives. The boy's steps faltered as Titan held his ground, a living wall of muscle and discipline, eyes locked with a silent warning that sent a chill through the gathered crowd. The boy's hands fidgeted at his sides, fingers curling into fists and then relaxing as if battling the urge to run. But there was nowhere to go. Not under the weight of those stairs, and certainly not with Titan's unwavering focus pinning him in place. Mason felt the air thicken with tension, each second dragging out as the boy shifted his weight, and the unmistakable hollow clunk of a prosthetic leg echoed against the tiled floor, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the uneasy silence. Mason stepped forward cautiously, his voice measured and calm despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. "Son, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment," he said, his eyes scanning the boy's every twitch, every panicked breath. The boy shook his head, almost imperceptibly, his lips parting but no words escaping, his throat working against the emotion that seemed to choke him. Mason recognized that look. The haunted eyes of someone carrying a burden far too heavy for their years. Eyes that had seen loss before they'd even had a chance to understand life. Titan's growl deepened, his body low and tense, his senses screaming that something wasn't right. The line behind the boy backed away instinctively, veterans instinctively stepping forward as if ready to shield the innocent or confront the threat. their instincts as sharp as Mason's. Mason lowered himself to the boy's level, his tone softening but his senses razor sharp. "What's your name, son?" he asked gently. The boy swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "Caleb, Caleb Raines," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of his own name. And something about it tugged at a long-buried memory in Mason's mind. A name he'd read in casualty reports, a name that belonged to a hero lost on foreign soil. Mason's heart clenched as realization dawned, but the question still hung heavy between. Them. Why was Titan reacting this way? And what was hidden beneath the surface of this fragile young man standing before them? Mason's gaze dropped briefly to the prosthetic leg, a battered, scuffed relic that seemed far too worn for a boy so young, its metal edges chipped and dulled by time and travel. His mind raced through every training scenario, every instinct honed by years of service. But none of them could explain the deep, almost mournful way Titan seemed to recognize something unseen, something etched into the very air around the boy. And as Mason reached out, slowly, carefully, toward the prosthetic, the weight of the entire gathering pressed down on that single moment. Every breath held, every heart beating as one, waiting to see what truth would finally step out from the shadows. Caleb's fingers shook uncontrollably as he fumbled with the worn leather straps, his knuckles pale against the weathered surface of the prosthetic that had clearly seen more miles and more heartbreak than any ordinary piece of metal should. The crowd seemed frozen in time, every movement slowed, every breath suspended in the thick air as Mason crouched low, his eyes flickering between the boy's tear-lined face and the hollow chamber about to reveal its hidden truth. Titan stood motionless beside him, his deep brown eyes never leaving the boy's, his senses still on high alert, as though he could feel the weight of a history too heavy to bear. With a final tug, Caleb loosened the last strap, the prosthetic leg slipping free from his frail frame and landing with a muted thud against the floor. A sound that seemed to echo off the marble walls like the closing of a forgotten door. Mason reached out, his gloved fingers brushing against the cold, hollowed-out space inside the prosthetic, his heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum in his ears. His mind flashed through every possibility, contraband, explosives, something meant to do harm. But nothing could have prepared him for what his fingers touched next. His hand emerged slowly, trembling under the weight of something far more devastating than any weapon. Cradled in his palm was a folded, time-worn letter, the edges frayed and darkened with age, and atop it rested a medal of honor, its once gleaming surface dulled by years of sorrow and sacrifice. The room was silent, the kind of silence that wraps around your throat and makes it hard to breathe. Mason unfolded the fragile paper with the delicate care of a man holding the last surviving piece of a shattered life. The ink faded but still legible, each word carrying the raw, unfiltered emotions of a soldier's final goodbye. His voice caught in his throat as he read the opening line aloud, the words slicing through the heavy air like a blade. "To my son, if you're reading this, it means I never made it home." The letter trembled in Mason's hands as he continued, the words painting a vivid portrait of a man who had known his fate long before it came. A man who poured every ounce of his love and regret into a final message for the child he would never hold. Tears welled in the eyes of hardened veterans, as the reality of the moment settled over them like a storm cloud. Caleb's shoulders shook as silent sobs racked his thin frame, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as if holding onto the last fragile threads of his composure. Mason knelt before him, his own eyes glassy with emotion. And in that heart-wrenching moment, every person in that room understood that the prosthetic wasn't just a tool for walking, it was a vessel carrying the final echoes of a father's love, a soldier's sacrifice, and a son's unbreakable bond to a hero he never got to meet. Mason's throat tightened as his gloved fingers gently unfolded the brittle edges of the letter, the paper so fragile it felt like it might crumble under the weight of the moment. His voice was low at first, barely more than a whisper, but the raw emotion woven into each word seemed to carry through the silent room with the weight of 1,000 echoes. "To my son," Mason began, his voice cracking against the thick wall of tension that seemed to close in around them. "If you're reading this, it means I never made it home. I prayed every night that I would see you grow, hear your first words, hold your hand through life's storms. But if I couldn't be there, I wanted you to know I never stopped loving you. Not for a single heartbeat. Mason paused, swallowing hard as the words began to blur in his vision, his mind momentarily lost to the battlefield memories that suddenly felt too close, too raw. Around him, the hardened faces of veterans broke beneath the weight of shared understanding, their stoic expressions crumbling, as years of buried grief rose to the surface. Mothers held, folded flags tighter against their chests, fathers pulled children close, and the younger soldiers stood motionless, their eyes wide with the realization of what real sacrifice looked like. Mason steadied his voice and pressed on. This medal, they call it a Medal of Honor, but it's not for me. It's for you, son. For the courage you'll need to face a world without me in it. For the battles you'll fight in your heart long after the wars have ended. Keep it close, and know that no matter where you walk, my steps are with you. By the time Mason finished, the room had transformed into a sanctuary of silent grief and quiet pride. Tears rolled down the faces of men who hadn't cried in decades, their shoulders shaking with memories of comrades lost and families left behind. Caleb stood frozen, his face a portrait of stunned disbelief, his small, trembling hands clutching the metal as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth beneath his feet. Titan broke the stillness, his head lifting slowly, eyes filled with a depth of understanding no words could match. He stepped forward, his powerful frame lowering gently onto his haunches before the boy, and with a slow, deliberate movement, pressed his muzzle to Caleb's hand, as if delivering a soldier's final salute. In that charged silence, Mason realized something unspoken had happened. This wasn't just the reading of a letter, it was the closing of a wound and the opening of a new chapter for a boy who had carried the unbearable weight of a father's absence in every silent step he'd taken. And though the letter was now read and the metal held tightly against a young heart, its true meaning would live on, etched forever into the lives of everyone who stood witness to the day the weight of sacrifice became too powerful to ignore. Caleb's voice was barely audible above the crushing silence, a fragile whisper that seemed to tremble against the weight of 1,000 memories never lived. My father, Captain Elijah Rains, he never came home. He choked out, his eyes locked on the floor as if afraid that meeting the gaze of those around him would shatter what little resolve he had left. His hands clutched the tarnished Medal of Honor so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the trembling of his small fingers betraying the storm of grief that raged just beneath the surface. Mason knelt before him, the worn letter still resting in his gloved hand, his heart breaking in ways he hadn't felt since the battlefield. Caleb swallowed hard and continued, his words halting, his breath hitching between every sentence like each memory was a wound being torn open. He was deployed before I was born. My mom said he wrote letters every week, sent them home like breadcrumbs leading back to a life he hoped to return to. But that last mission, they told her there wasn't enough left to bring home. Just his tags, just his leg. Caleb's voice cracked, the anguish rolling through his words like thunder in a dark sky. My mom couldn't bear to keep it, but I needed to have something, anything of him. So I took it. I had it modified when I lost mine from the accident. His hands brushed unconsciously over the jagged scar along his thigh, where the prosthetic usually sat, his shoulders sagging under the invisible weight of a legacy far heavier than any boy his age should ever have to carry. It's all I have, he whispered, his voice breaking into a sob so raw it seemed to fracture the air itself. Everywhere I walked, it felt like he was walking with me. Like maybe if I stepped far enough, I'd finally find him. Mason felt his own throat tighten, his mind flashing back to a war-zone sunset, the acrid scent of burning sand and metal filling his lungs, the haunting echoes of brothers lost in a blaze of violence and sacrifice. And now here stood this boy, a living testament to the ghosts they all carried, a child walking through life on the very reminder of what war takes and never returns. The room remained silent, no words spoken because there were none that could ease the ache of that truth. Even the most hardened soldiers stood still, their hats pressed against their chests, their eyes misted with the memories of children left behind, of letters written and medals delivered to empty doorways. And in the midst of that unbearable stillness, Titan stepped forward again, his massive head lowering until his muzzle rested gently against Caleb's arm, a silent promise that the boy was not alone. In that singular moment, surrounded by the echoes of a father's sacrifice and a son's impossible courage, every soul in that room knew they were standing in the presence of something greater than grief. It was legacy, it was love, and it was a reminder that even in the deepest shadows of loss, the light of those who've fallen continues to walk with the living. Titan moved with a grace that defied his powerful frame, his every step deliberate, his every breath steady as he closed the distance between himself and the battered prosthetic resting against the cold marble floor. His dark, soulful eyes locked onto the scarred metal, as if reading the silent history written into every scratch, every dent, every faded marking left behind by a man who had given everything. Without hesitation, Titan lowered his head, his muzzle brushing against the cool surface with a tenderness that seemed almost human, his nose lingering there as if drawing in the last lingering traces of a soldier's life lived with honor and ended with sacrifice. The weight of the moment pressed down on the room like a storm cloud ready to break, hearts beating in slow, heavy thuds against ribs that felt suddenly too tight, lungs forgetting how to breathe as the great canine warrior honored a fallen comrade not with words but with an act so pure, so profound it transcended language itself. Mason stood frozen, his eyes glistening as he watched his loyal partner do something no training had ever taught him. Something that came not from obedience, but from a deep, unspoken understanding, forged through years of standing at the edge of life and death. Titan's head lifted slowly, his chest expanding as he drew in a long breath, and then, with a sound that seemed to pull the sorrow from every corner of the room, he released a low, mournful howl. It wasn't loud or sharp, it was deep and haunting, a sorrowful call that seemed to vibrate through the very bones of the gathered crowd, carrying with it the memories of every fallen soldier, every final goodbye, every child left behind in the wake of war. The sound rolled through the room like a distant drumbeat on a battlefield long abandoned, yet somehow still alive in the hearts of those who had walked its blood-soaked paths. Veterans bowed their heads, some clutching medals pinned to their chests, others gripping folded flags until their knuckles turned white. Mothers wept openly, their sobs muffled against the shoulders of loved ones who could offer nothing more than silent comfort. Even the youngest children seemed to understand that this was not a moment for words or questions. This was a moment for remembrance. Caleb stood motionless, his tear-streaked face tilted up as if searching for something in the unseen distance, his father's medal held tightly against his chest, his small shoulders rising and falling with each shallow breath as he absorbed the profound honor being paid to a man he'd never met but loved, with every broken piece of his heart. And as Titan's howl faded into the heavy silence, replaced only by the soft rustle of fabric and the barely there echoes of stifled sobs, it became clear that this was no longer just a gathering. It had become a living tribute, a battlefield of emotion where the ghosts of the past walked among the living, and a boy found for the first time in his life that he wasn't walking alone. The air was so thick with emotion it felt as though even the walls held their breath, the weight of collective sorrow and pride pressing down like a silent storm rolling through the hearts of everyone present. One by one, the veterans, men forged in the fires of battles both distant and painfully close, removed their hats with trembling hands, their weathered faces etched with lines that told stories of sacrifice and loss, their eyes clouded with memories too heavy to speak aloud. They stood at rigid attention, a silent formation of living monuments to the fallen, their posture a testament to the unbreakable code they lived by. Leave no brother behind, even in death. Across the room, mothers who had borne the unbearable clutched folded flags against their chests, as if trying to hold back the flood of grief that threatened to break through with every shuddering breath. Their tears fell freely now, glistening trails of sorrow tracing paths down cheeks that had long since learned the art of silent endurance. And amidst them all, the children stood wide-eyed and still, watching in hushed awe as the weight of history unfolded before them, their young hearts quietly absorbing the raw truth of what it meant to love someone who had given everything. Caleb remained at the center of it all, his small frame standing straighter now as though the unseen hand of his father rested gently on his shoulder, steadying him in the moment he needed it most. His fingers clung tightly to the tarnished Medal of Honor pressed against his chest, the cool metal warming beneath the heat of his trembling hands. Though his vision blurred with tears, he lifted his head high, meeting the gaze of the men who stood before him, their eyes heavy with understanding, their silent stares speaking the words their mouths could not form. "You are one of us now, son." Titan sat loyally at Caleb's side, his dark eyes scanning the gathered faces as if counting every soul, his powerful chest rising and falling in slow, deliberate rhythm. His presence alone a calming force amidst the storm of emotion swirling through the grand hall. Mason stood just behind them, his chest tight with a pride he hadn't felt since his own days of service, his heart breaking and healing all at once as he witnessed the invisible threads of loyalty, sacrifice, and love binding this fractured moment into something whole and unforgettable. And as the minutes stretched into eternity, not a word was spoken, not a single voice broke the sacred silence. In that shared stillness, the boundaries of age, rank, and experience dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the raw, unfiltered truth that they were all connected by the same unseen scars, the same relentless ache of loss, and the same unshakable hope that their sacrifices had not been in vain. For in that moment, as the echoes of Titan's mournful howl faded and the boy who had carried the weight of a father's absence stood proud among giants, every person in that room knew with absolute certainty that some legacies live on, not through words or grand gestures, but through the quiet, unwavering strength of those left behind. Mason's knees met the cold marble floor with a quiet finality as he lowered himself before the boy, his hands moving carefully, reverently, as though he held something far more delicate than a medal. He held a legacy, a final promise from a father to his son. The tarnished Medal of Honor rested in his palm for a heartbeat longer before he gently pressed it back into Caleb's trembling hands, folding the boy's small fingers over it as if sealing a lifelong bond. Mason's voice broke through the thick, reverent silence, raw and filled with the kind of truth that cuts straight through to the soul. "Your father never left you," he whispered, the words trembling against the heavy air. "He's been walking with you every step of the way." Caleb's eyes, red and glassy with tears that refused to fall, locked onto Mason's. And in that fragile connection, an entire lifetime of absence seemed to collapse into a single, powerful moment of belonging. His lips parted, his chin quivered, but no words came. Only the silent understanding that for the first time in his life, he wasn't standing in his father's shadow. He was standing in his light. Around them, the sea of veterans and grieving families watched in hushed reverence, their own battles momentarily forgotten as they bore witness to something far greater than ceremony or tradition. It was the living, breathing embodiment of sacrifice, of honor passed down through generations, of a young boy stepping into the place his father had left behind, not with sorrow alone, but with undeniable pride. Caleb's thin shoulders squared slightly, his small chest rising as he pressed the metal tight against his heart, his fingers clutching it like a lifeline to a man he'd never touched but had somehow always known. And as the weight of that metal settled against his heart, it felt less like a burden and more like a shield, something that would carry him through every storm life had left in store. Titan, ever watchful, rose slowly to his feet and took his place beside Caleb, his head level with the boy's shoulder, his deep brown eyes scanning the horizon as if standing post for a fallen comrade's son. The quiet bond between them spoke volumes, a silent oath that as long as Titan walked this earth, Caleb would never again have to face it alone. Mason stood slowly, his own chest tight with pride and grief intertwined, his gaze lingering on the boy who seemed to stand just a little taller now. And in that hallowed hall, under the soft glow of sunlight streaming through the towering windows, every person present felt it. A shift, a moment when the pain of loss was eclipsed by the unbreakable strength of legacy, when the long, winding path of grief found its way to hope. In that instant, Caleb Rains didn't just carry his father's medal, he carried his father's courage, his sacrifice, his undying love, and with Titan by his side, he would never have to carry it alone. As the final notes of the bugle's haunting call echoed through the grand hall, and the colors were slowly lowered with trembling hands, Titan remained unmoving by Caleb's side, his massive head resting gently on the boy's thin knee, his deep brown eyes half closed, but ever watchful. The ceremony might have been drawing to a close for the gathered crowd, but for Titan, the moment was far from over. Around them, people slowly began to leave, their footsteps quiet, respectful, as if afraid to disturb the sacred stillness that clung to the space where boy and dog sat, bound by something unspoken and unbreakable. Veterans moved past with solemn nods, their eyes lingering on the boy who now held his father's medal like a talisman against the world. His fingers wrapped so tightly around it, his knuckles turned white. Yet even as the crowd thinned and the grand hall emptied of life and sound, Titan refused to move. His powerful body was still, his breathing slow and deliberate, as though every rise and fall of his chest was a silent promise to remain on watch, until Caleb found his footing not just on the marble floor beneath him, but in the life ahead of him that had felt so unbearably heavy only hours before. Mason stood nearby, his arms crossed over his broad chest, his eyes locked on the boy and his loyal guardian, his heart caught in a strange place between pride and sorrow, hope and regret. He had seen soldiers stand sentinel for fallen comrades before, but never had he witnessed such a profound act of silent devotion from a creature who asked for nothing in return. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and then, without a word, something changed. Caleb lifted his head slowly, his eyes clearing of the fog of grief, his chin rising in a quiet, almost defiant gesture that carried the unmistakable weight of newfound purpose. His small shoulders rolled back, his chest lifted, and for the first time since the weight of his father's memory had settled into his bones, he stood, not shakily, not with hesitation, but with a strength that seemed to pulse through him from the ground up. Like the very spirit of Captain Elijah Rains had settled into his son's heart and reminded him who he was. Titan rose with him, his movements fluid and sure, his dark eyes meeting Caleb's for the briefest of moments before turning outward again, standing tall at the boy's side like a soldier ready to march forward into whatever came next. And in that simple act, as the last beams of sunlight slanted through the high windows and bathed them both in a golden glow, it was clear that Titan's final watch was not a farewell, but a transition, a passing of the torch from the fallen to the living, from the memories of sacrifice to the promise of resilience. Together, side by side, Caleb and Titan turned toward the great doors of the hall, their silhouettes framed against the light, and without looking back, they walked forward into a future forever shaped by the courage of those who had come before them. The sky hung heavy with thick gray clouds that threatened rain but held back as if even the heavens understood that today was not a day for sorrow, but for remembrance. The polished stone of the National Memorial gleamed beneath the overcast sky, its surface cool to the touch and etched with the names of heroes long gone but never forgotten. And now, beneath that towering wall of sacrifice, a new plaque stood proudly, its inscription simple yet profound, for the sons and daughters who carry the weight of sacrifice. Caleb stood before it, his small hands steady as they held Titan's leash, the once tarnished Medal of Honor, now polished to a quiet brilliance, hanging proudly against his chest. He had grown in the passing months, not just in stature, but in presence, his shoulders squared with the silent confidence of someone who had walked through the storm of loss and emerged on the other side carrying more than just grief. He carried the unbreakable spirit of a legacy too powerful to fade. Titan stood tall beside him, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with a sentinel's unwavering focus. His ears flicked forward as the faintest breeze whispered, through the rows of flags standing at half-mast, their fabric rustling like the quiet murmurs of history itself. The crowd gathered behind them was vast, a sea of uniforms and civilian clothes alike, all eyes drawn to the boy who had come to represent every child who had waited at the door for a father that would never return, every son and daughter who bore the invisible weight of a folded flag in their hearts. As the final words of the dedication ceremony drifted into silence, the wind stirred again, a soft, almost sacred current that carried with it the faintest scent of gunpowder and desert winds, of old battlefields and forgotten promises, the scent of remembrance woven through time itself. And in that moment, as the flags billowed gently and the clouds parted just enough to let a thin beam of sunlight fall across the memorial, Titan lifted his massive head, his nose tilted toward the horizon, where the land met the sky in a perfect, endless line. His chest expanded with a deep breath, and then, with a sound that seemed to rise from the very heart of the earth, he howled, a low, mournful, powerful cry that cut through the air and echoed against the stone walls of the memorial like the final, eternal salute of every hero who had ever walked into battle and never returned. The sound wrapped around the gathered crowd, settling into their bones, a haunting reminder that though the years may pass and the world may forget the battles fought in distant lands, the echoes of those sacrifices live on in the hearts of the living. Caleb reached up with one hand, his fingers brushing over the cold metal of his father's medal, and in that simple gesture, the promise was made clear. He would carry this legacy forward, not in sadness, but with the pride of a son who now fully understood the meaning of courage. And as Titan's howl faded into the wind and the crowd stood silent beneath the watchful eyes of history, it became more than a ceremony. It became a vow that the echoes of heroes would never fall silent. Not as long as their children walked the earth, standing tall beneath the weight of their sacrifice.